Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I am so honored to be able to speak to you about my vocation, but I'd like to just say a few words in relation to the shrine. So we did some research before we actually met with the architects and started getting into the details of it, and we went on a little excursion. But one of the things, we did not go to this place, but the mission where Junipero Serra is buried is in Carmel, California. And it is by far one of my favorites of all of the mission churches. I once went with my brother and his 4 children to California, and we did like 17 of the missions. We went to Carmel, and I've been there once before, but I love Carmel. And honestly, we had kind of debated. I suggested to the committee that we buried Blessed Stanley Rother like Junipero Serra was buried, literally in the floor right in front of the altar. Very simple. Well, that didn't fly because we needed to put him in the altar. But anyway, but that was an inspiration. And of course, one of the challenges of building a mission church that seats 2,000 people is most mission churches are very small. And so the architects had to do a little bit of, they had to be creative in how they could make this massive church still feel intimate and still feel like those mission churches that we know and love. But anyway, so it is an honor to have been part of that project, which is really 10 years in the making, but especially the art part. That's the part I really was excited about. The wood ceiling, the tile floor, and the ceramic tile roof. I went to bat on those 3 things. Someone on the committee said, well, Father, you can add a wood roof later. And I said, you'll never add it later. Just pay up. We got to do it. There won't be any reason to do that. Anyway, so let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, the source of all life and love, you who call us by name to be your disciples, open our hearts that we might receive your call, that we may encourage others to hear your voice, and that we may live out the vocation that you have called us faithfully, recognizing that you are with us, that you guide us, that you inspire us, and you help us. Look over the Serra Club and all those who dedicate themselves to the promotion of vocations, to the priesthood and the religious life. Look upon my brother priests, sisters, brothers, religious, our deacons, our bishop, and all those who serve in religious vocations in our diocese and throughout our country and the world. Lord, as we enter more deeply into this sacred season of Lent, help us to be mindful of your mercy, for you are full of life and redemption to the sinner who comes to you, and to your Son, who lives and reigns with you forever and ever. Amen. In the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Saint Junipero Serra. Okay, I've divided my vocation talk into basically 3 sections. If you had a timeline, it's not, I need to go put it here. Okay. If we had a timeline, I would have 3 main dates: 1967, 1995, and 2009. Now you figure it out. Well, the first one is easy. I was born on June 29th, 1967. That is the feast, the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, and I was named William Leonard. Later, I said to my mother, hello, I was born on the great solemnity of Peter and Paul, and you named me William Leonard? And she said, well, we weren't that liturgical back then. So yes, I was born on June 29, 1967 in Chicago, Illinois. I was baptized 2 weeks later at Epiphany Church on the south side of Chicago. And that began for me my childhood, my life. I'm the oldest of 5 children. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And my family, if I could classify my family at that time, my father and mother were very committed to family, to faith, to education, and to the Boy Scouts. That was pretty much my childhood. We did many things together as a family. All of my mom is one of 8, and her father died when she was 8 years old. He was 35. He was a postman in Chicago. And my grandmother was pregnant with the 8th child when he died. So she's a saint, okay? So Grandma Helen was a saint. She raised these children, sent them to Catholic schools, and she worked. She had to get a job, and she worked. She never remarried, but she was extremely faithful. She was one of those Catholics who never, probably ever questioned her faith. She was very devoted to her faith and to her parish and raised her children in that faith. And she received help from the church. They spoke about Helen and her 8 children and how, and that became part of our family. Growing up, we heard a lot about that. I never obviously knew my grandfather. My mother barely knew him. She was the favorite, apparently. She's like the 4th oldest girl. She has 3 older sisters and then her. But anyway, and so I grew up in a family that my parents were both, my father was a Methodist. He was not raised Catholic, but in order to marry my mother, he had to become Catholic. Back then, if you were non-Catholic, if you married a non-Catholic, you got married in the rectory. So you couldn't really even have a church wedding. So anyway, he hung out with Catholics. He was basically a Catholic. They were non-practicing Methodists, and it was not a big jump for him to become Catholic. They raised all 5 of us in the church. We left Chicago when I was 3 and moved to Joliet, to a small town called New Lenox, Illinois, Joliet. And then from there, when I was 12, we moved to Oklahoma. And one of the big differences between Oklahoma and Chicago that I remember was relating to church was that up there in Chicago, everyone's Catholic. So people tend to take their faith for granted. You never really talked about it. It's just what you did. You know, there was a Catholic church just about everywhere. But in Oklahoma, the parishes were smaller, but actually more vibrant. And we found a very healthy, happy faith community and parish at St. Philip Neri in Midwest City. When my parents moved here, I don't know why they only stayed on the south side of town, but they stayed in a hotel on Southeast 29th Street. I mean, that's like a bad street, but they didn't know anything. So my father wanted to be close to work. He worked for General Motors, and he traveled an hour to and from work in Chicago, and so they bought a home very close to Tinker Air Force Base, 5 minutes from General Motors, and we went to Midwest City. And that's where my childhood really took shape as far as being 12, much more aware of things happening. My before that, sort of uninteresting childhood, as far as being with my family and that sort of thing. We went to Catholic schools, and my parents were very important. The education was very important. And then, of course, the Boy Scouts. So I'm the only Eagle Scout probably in the history of the Boy Scouts that hates camping. I love the leadership part of it. I could do a merit badge faster than my 2 brothers. I was all about that part of it, the organizational part, but going to summer camp was really not my thing. Even with my father there, he would always go with us, but I was very homesick. I didn't like the whole thing. But funny with me, I would dread it. I would make myself sick. I would call home sometimes. This is when we go on campouts, not summer camp. And I could hear my dad in the background saying, "Betty, we're not picking him up. Betty, we're not picking him up." And I'm like, "Mom, I don't feel good." And she'd go, "He doesn't feel good. We're not picking him up." So after that call, I would eventually sort of get with it, and I would be fine. So anyway, I went to Mount St. Mary High School. When I graduated from high school in 1985, my class predicted that I would be a priest and the president and the principal of Mount St. Mary. So people began to see within me this priestly character, if you will. I actually, for myself, never really thought about it very much, but growing up in the Novak family, priesthood was always talked about. My parents would have loved for the 3 boys to become priests and my sisters to become nuns. They honestly said that a lot. So we grew up in that kind of environment. We were required to participate in church in some way. Of course, the only thing open option for us was being an altar server. So all the Novak children, especially the 3 older ones, we were always servers. And Mother would get to Mass early, which means if the server didn't show up, guess who was serving? Because we'd see the priest come out and he'd be like, we'd be like, "Here he comes." And "Betty, can they serve?" And she'd go, "Yep." And she answered for us. There was never any question that we wouldn't. I was horrible in church, absolutely the worst. So being up in the sanctuary was better for me because in the pew, I was always teasing my brothers and sisters, putting the pew down just so it hits her foot, My sister Ellen, all I had to do was just hold my finger out. I didn't even have to touch her, and it would freak her out. Or fake a rubber band. Oh my gosh, she would just go nuts. So here I am. So I usually was separated from the others. At some point in the Mass, I would get pulled off. So becoming a priest actually was probably in my cards because I was much better at church if I was by myself, up in a chair somewhere away from them. So when I graduated high school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I thought maybe possibly going back to Chicago for school. Don't ask me why. I mean, we were from there. I was proud of being from Chicago. I was, 17 years old, so I didn't know anything. But I thought I'd go back to college there. So I got accepted to Loyola University in Chicago, and it cost a whopping $13,000 in 1985. Now it's probably $75,000. But anyway, that was way too much that I had. And by the way, my parents, after I got accepted, they said, son, by the way, we're not going to pay for college. I was like, oh, okay, well, great. Glad to know that. So I decided to stay home. I was thinking dentistry at that time. I also batted around, believe it or not, architecture. That actually was in my mind. But I really wasn't sure. So I knew I couldn't afford Loyola. So I stayed at home and went to Rose State College and got my basics out of the way. And then that turned into another year because I realized after getting a job at a bank, if I would have sold my car, emptied my savings, I could have gone to Loyola. I could have afforded 1 year with some loans and with some scholarships. But then what was I going to do the next year? So the dream of going back to Chicago and going to that kind of school just kind of left. And I was, at home and going to Rose State. I was working at a bank. And it was during that time that my pastor had taken me to dinner. Now, this seems so cliche, but honestly, this was an important moment in my story because he took me to dinner, and during dinner, he asked me, have you ever considered the priesthood? Now, again, growing up in the Novak household, yeah, it was always out there, but to be asked by a priest, had I ever thought about it? That changed. That was different. And I told him, I said, well, actually, I have thought about it, but I'm not sure. So he said, well, think about it. And I said, okay. And I felt a tinge bit of obligation since he had just bought my meal. So I felt like I needed to say, okay, I'll think about it. Well, I thought about it for about a year. And then he came up to me and he said, so what do you think? And I said, well, I'm just not sure. And then he said something else that I'd never thought about, but it made perfect sense. He said, a seminary is a place to decide. Prior to this, I always thought, if you want to be a priest and you go to the seminary, then you're going to be a priest. Like there was no room for discernment, It was like, no one would go to the seminary unless you were sure. And I'm sure there are people that go to medical school that end up not becoming doctors or, accountants or whatever. There's a process of discernment, which I had never thought about. So at that time, my pastor had asked me to be the head of the young adult program. So I was barely a young adult. I think I was like just 18. And I was leading this group at the parish. I was on the parish council. And so things started falling into place. I applied to the seminary. And at that time, there were basically two options for college: Conception Seminary in Missouri and St. Meinrad in Indiana. The vocation director at the time took me to Conception. And so all the guys there, guys like Father Ratterman, he was there when I went to visit in 1986. And Father Oswald was also there. And they were convinced that I was going to Conception Seminary. Why would he bring you here if he's not going to send you here? Well, I went to St. Meinrad. And I graduated college in 1990 with my degree was in English with a philosophy minor. Now, all college seminarians have to major in philosophy. But back then, we could pick. We minored in philosophy because philosophy is the foundation of theology. So I had an English literature degree, and I loved college, and I loved St. Meinrad. I'd never been to Europe, but when I arrived, St. Meinrad is located in the rolling hills of southern Indiana in the Hoosier National Forest. I came up over the hill in my '67 Camaro, and I saw this beautiful building that looked like something out of Europe, made of sandstone with turrets and towers, and it just was, and I felt like I was home. And in many ways, I was. because the next 3 years were fantastic. I was studying things that I found very interesting. The thing about it, and it's a monastic, there's a monastery there, so that the whole monastic life was very attractive. Being with guys from mostly the Midwest made some great friends. College was wonderful. It was great. And I really wanted to be away at school. My parents kind of raised us kids to go away to college. They didn't want us to stay here. Again, they didn't factor in, we're not paying for it. But anyway, they still wanted us to go. So I was excited to be away and to be in Indiana. And the first couple weeks I was a little sad, but I was ready to go. And just made some wonderful friends, some of whom I still keep in contact with today. I graduated in '90 from St. Meinrad College, which has now been closed, and I ended up staying there for theology. It wasn't my choice, and at the time I didn't think anything of it, but now looking back, I kind of wished I had gone to another seminary just to get a different, most of the time guys don't stay in one place for both college and theology. But I did. And when I was there, there were a lot of people from Oklahoma that were studying there. I think at one point we had 30 men from Oklahoma, from the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City there. So there was a lot of people from home. It's about a 12-hour drive from here to there. Theology was great, 4 years of academic work, and then in between my second and third year, we were required in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City to do a pastoral year. So I came back to Our Lady's Cathedral, and I lived there for a year. And I got to kind of see how the priests live in a rectory, kind of get the routine and feel about it. So up to this point, everything is going really well. Like, I'm happy, things I'm studying, I'm meeting people, I'm getting to really get a great view of the priesthood. And I'm feeling inspired to continue my discernment. My discernment is all thumbs up. I had a spiritual director, that was fruitful, went on retreats, all the things that are required of us, I was right there. And never had any problems, really. We did a self-evaluation every year. Mine always got accepted. There were, there was a couple teachers I wish I didn't have, and but that's life. But overall, very positive. I was ordained a deacon in the, October of 1994. And I was ordained a deacon, transitional deacon, at St. Meinrad. That was the tradition back then. Now guys tend to come home and they're ordained, or in Rome. But I was ordained there at the seminary, and it was the best day of my life. It was the culmination of many years of formation and study. My family was there. It's the first time I wore this, the collar. So now seminarians wear the collar. We were forbidden to wear it. So I remember putting it on and like, does it fit? And by the way, I just now recently started wearing the tabs. I was always the old school with the collarette that goes all the way around, Some of my priest friends make fun of me now that I'm wearing a tab. It's just easier. Anyway, so put that on, the suit, it was great. And the highlight, going to the seminary, the highlight was always going to the ordinations of guys that you knew in the seminary. We would always go to the deacon ordinations or back here at home. The first ordination I went to was the ordination of Father Wood, who's a very good friend of mine, and Father Weisenberger. They were ordained, and I remember going, that was my first year, 1987, when I went to the seminary. And the highlight of an ordination for me, was always the Litany of the Saints. Because at that point, the priest or the candidate for the priesthood or the diaconate or the bishop lays flat on the floor of the church, prostrated, and the choir and the congregation sings the Litany of Saints. And I always remember thinking and envisioning myself there in each year as I would attend it. So I'm at my transitional deacon ordination, and I'm really looking forward to this. And there was a couple of problems. So the first problem is I was wearing brand new shoes, and I was at the end of the carpet, and the floor of the Abbey Church was a rough concrete. So I was afraid that I was going to scuff my toes, okay? So you're thinking, and I'm thinking, this is a holy moment, and this is what he's thinking about. Okay. The other thing is that I learned over the years that when guys let their heads rest down onto their hands, it's a long thing. They get a red mark on their head. And so when they're being ordained, they got this big red dot on their head. So I'm elevating my head just ever so slightly off of my hands. My feet are slightly raised. And then the worst part was that as I was going down, I realized that no one bothered to vacuum this carpet, which had been rolled up since the last year's ordination. It was full of dust. So I'm trying to regulate my breathing so I'm not sucking it in. Okay, all of this is to say this was not a holy moment for me. But I was ordained a deacon, and it was a glorious, my godmother was there, other members of my family. I found some pictures recently of it, and it was fantastic. And then, so that was in October, and we were always ordained 6 months before our priesthood ordination. So I would have been ordained a priest in 1995. But in January of 95, I had a crisis. I had a vocation crisis. I thought it started out just as cold feet, like, you're getting close and you had to get your chalice and your vestments and the invitations and all that. And so I thought, oh, it's just being cold, big deal, big thing coming up. But it got more complicated than that in the sense that I was in DC studying, what was I studying? Homiletics. We had to do, as part of our 4 years of theology, a January interterm that was ecumenical, and I'd put it off for 4 years. So I came to the last thing. So I did a study of homiletics at the Episcopal Washington Cathedral. They have a homiletics school there, and I was studying there. But while I was in DC, I was like, look at this and all this stuff, and am I, really called to be a priest? And do I really want to go back to Oklahoma, or do I want to, do something else? So all that was working. Plus, there was a lot happening. 1995 was a tough year for Oklahomans, and even in my own family, we had some tragedies. There was a lot happening. And so I went to my spiritual director, and this is a big date on my calendar, on my timeline, 1995. And I started out talking to my spiritual director and determined that this was more than just cold feet, that truly I didn't feel ready. Now, it seems bizarre because I had all the credentials. There was no other classes to take. I had fulfilled every of the requirements, but there was something deep within me that was saying, you're not ready. It didn't feel right. Something else I learned in my childhood is my parents I called them pressure parents, but really they kept us accountable. So if we signed up for something, we could not quit. In fact, I signed up for basketball. I'm a horrible basketball player. And like halfway through the season, I'm like, I'm no help to this team. I'm actually hurting them, but they would not let us quit. And that instilled in me this sense of having integrity, of recognizing that I need to listen to what's going on here. I don't want to just go through the motions. I just don't want to just have this happen because it's the next thing that's supposed to happen. So I called the Archbishop. At the time, it was Archbishop Beltran, and I told him, I'm not ready. And he said, almost too quickly, then I'm not going to ordain you. And there felt like a weight had lifted off my shoulder, but at the same time, I was filled with some disappointment. And I thought of all the people back home here in the diocese, but also at St. Philip's who've been praying for me. And how was I going to be able to handle that? I then, right after meeting with him, my family flew out to California and I baptized, I'm a deacon still, I baptized my niece, Bridget, who I also did her wedding just a few years ago. And at that, while we were in San Diego, I went and had dinner with breakfast with my parents, and I told them that I wasn't going to go on, that I was taking some time out. And I was very, very nervous about that. And my mother said to me something I will never forget, and it really did help me. She said, son, we want you to be a priest, but it's not our vocation. It's your vocation. You're the one that's going to have to live it. We don't have to live it. So you need to decide if God's calling you. And if he's not, then don't do this, because you will not be a good priest. You will not be a happy priest. And I was so afraid that I would disappoint them. And the way she responded, she said, this is your vocation. So you have to live it. Doesn't matter what we think. It's what you think and what you're willing to do. So I came back to Oklahoma and I got a job at Catholic Charities. Right here. Tim O'Connor heard that I wasn't going on. He called me. I had no job. And so I got an apartment not far from here and I worked here. And slowly over those year and a half, that's how long it took, I started feeling, gosh, I really felt more at ease with this. It seemed like just taking that little break helped me get perspective. And so I then, after about a year and a half, I really felt that God was calling me to be a priest. And I always knew that he was, but I was now willing to choose it and to align myself with his will. And that was huge because, a lot of people had said, you're truly called, and I even heard God saying it, but I was unwilling. So I went to Archbishop Beltran's office, and when you go, almost 10 years through the seminary, and then you leave, you don't get an appointment with the Archbishop right off the bat. I mean, they put you on the schedule. So it was a couple of weeks once I finally called and set up the appointment. And I remember going to his office and I said, Archbishop, I've come here today to ask you to please ordain me a priest to service in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. And he said it would be an honor and a privilege. And then he talked for about an hour. And I don't know what he was talking about because all I could hear was, I'm going to be a priest. I was ordained a priest on May 30th, 1997. And that was a great day. Much better than my diaconate, and for many ways, because again, I felt like I truly was doing this not just because it was the next thing to do, but I was, and again, I don't remember much from that liturgy, except it was very hot. I was ordained with Father Joseph Arledge. We were ordained, we did not go to school together, we didn't know each other that well, but we were ordained together. And that was 26 years ago. From there, I went to St. Charles Borromeo, and then I was made a pastor. Now, being a pastor for diocesan priests, that's kind of your goal. That's all I really wanted to be, was a pastor. And so after just 4 years after being ordained a priest, I was made administrator first in Yukon, and then the pastor. And at that time, there was a real conflict going on because it was around that time that the sexual abuse scandal had come out in Boston. So this is like 2001. And I'm just being named a pastor, which is my goal, which is like I'm at the height. And yet I'd wear my collar around town and people would scoff and say things. And it was like, pointing fingers, and everyone thought horrible things about priests. But for me, I was like very happy. I was like, I'm doing what God's called me to do. And even amid all of this, I know that they're so good in the church. That was one of the things that I was battling with, these horrible things that happened. But of course, there's also good things that are happening. And of course, being associated with bad priests, we all suffered as a result of that, even you, as the laity and other religious, and not just priests, but we all bear that to some extent. So that period of time was great at learning. I remember the first daily mass I had at St. Charles. That was my first assignment. I was sitting behind that door. At that church, when you open the door, the sacristy, you're literally right at the altar. And I was like, okay, what do? I'd go out there and I go, Father, Son. And then what do I say? The Lord be with you. Okay, so I was like rehearsing. It's like really practical stuff. We're way over time. Okay, 2009. Okay, so let's fast forward to 2009. Why is that significant? Well, it was the year of the priest. Pope Benedict had announced the year of the priest. And also at that time was a lot of talk about the new evangelization and missionary discipleship and intentional discipleship. These were things I had never heard. And through the convergence of all of those things, I had a renewed sense of my priesthood. Also, 2 years later in 2012, Pope Benedict had issued a new Roman Missal, a new translation of the Mass. And it elevated everything from what used to be the sacramentary. Now we were praying these prayers that were in English, but much closer to the original Latin. And it had dignity and grace, and it felt more elevated, more significant. And so all of those things converged, and I discovered a friendship with Jesus, which I had honestly, I thought that was a Protestant thing, Going to seminary in the 80s, late 80s and the 90s, and being ordained in the early 2000s, these are things I just never thought about. And yet here I was going through this renewed sense of priesthood, and it started with a relationship with Christ. And it seems so embarrassing to say, but I don't know that I really had a relationship with him in that way. Most of my relationship with him was in the community, in the parish, or in the work as a priest. But to develop a close personal relationship with him, that was life-changing. And it was an amazing experience for me to go through that. And then, again, while I'm doing this, I'm taking on other roles as vocation director. That was a moment where now I'm the father, literally, to some of these young men who are discerning. And I needed to be in touch with my priesthood because now I'm mentoring others who are considering it. And the tables kind of turned. And that's a real hinge moment for me in my story when I began realizing that I have a close relationship with Jesus and need that, aside from what I do. You guys, Richard mentioned it, I'm a doer. Give me something to do, I will do it. And that's all great and wonderful, and I'm grateful for anything I've been able to accomplish with others. But being in the Lord's presence, being a priest, more than doing priesthood, is really fundamental. And for me, it came later. I guess now in the seminary, they do spirituality years, and they really try to get guys more connected with that part. In my time, it wasn't. It was all kind of what you need to do. So I was grateful in 2009 and following, and even to this day, that relationship with Jesus is primary and more important than anything I do. And then, believe it or not, those of you who know me, this was way outside my comfort zone, but I did a 30-day silent retreat in South Dakota in March, a year ago, almost a year ago. And this was coming on the heels of having finished and accomplished and working with the shrine and just everything going on in my life, that sense that it really was coming from a place of wanting to just be with Jesus. And so going on this Ignatian retreat was something, honestly, I couldn't believe I was actually thinking about. And then when I was actually there doing it, was incredible. To sum things up, I mean, I think the keys that I would say to it is my vocation story is still going. I can't really tell you about, I mean, I can talk to you about how I got to the seminary, and then I can tell you how I got to be a priest and I got ordained, but God is continually calling me. And what's beautiful about the vocation of the priesthood or to marriage or whatever your vocation is once you're there, now you open up all sorts of doors, and God can use us in all sorts of ways. And we're not, sitting on the fence. That was the thing I was going through in 1995 is, well, could I do this, or could I do that, or should I do this? I wasn't doing anything but just, looking at my options. And I'm so glad that I was able to come to that point where I embraced this, because I've never looked back. I've never regretted that. Yeah, there are tough days in the priesthood like there is in anything in life. But I feel like being fully committed and open, the Lord can use me in whatever way. And I don't know until he calls me, until he invites me. And so I'm so blessed to be a parish priest. That's really where my heart is to be with the people. I serve the Archbishop, which I'm happy to do and have done for 12 years as the Vicar General. That's a whole different challenge. But many ways it's similar in working with people. It's just not as personal because the people I serve in my parish, I get to worship with every Sunday. So they see me as a priest, okay? They get to see me celebrate the Mass and hear their confessions and be part of the community. The people that come to the chancery, they don't necessarily see me that way. I'm just the bad guy. The Archbishop's the good guy, always, and that's great because he's our shepherd. And the Vicar General, I get to be the one who, gets to have those hard conversations. But even that is a grace. And going into all of those situations to know that, one of the things I would say about my story is that part what I realized as Vicar General, that I'm cleaning up messes that I didn't make. It's called charity. It's called sacrifice. I mean, I'm having to deal with stuff that I did not create. And I'm having to work with people that sometimes I don't really like. They would not be my friends. Okay? And this is being recorded. Okay. But that's being honest. I mean, and even that's okay. I mean, because it's not about that. And that's where I think in a vocation, we learn to set ourselves aside as best we can and use the gifts we have for the glory of God. Thank you all very much. Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you serve as a deacon in that year and a half?
The bishop, I did not serve. I kept my faculties. He simply asked me not to function as a deacon. I was still a transitional deacon, but I was not assigned to a parish or anything, and that was good. I think I needed a break from all that. I did go to Mass at Our Lady's because I did know some people there, and what I found was that slowly I was getting more involved. And one Easter Sunday, the pastor is reading, you know how Easter is. There's all the Alleluias, and I'm not supposed to say that word in Lent, but anyway, everyone's singing, and he's getting ready to read the Easter proclamation and give his homily. And I had a thought, I'm in the congregation, I thought, God forbid if something happened to him, if he had a heart attack, or if he passed out, or he couldn't do it, I could do it. And that was a moment when I realized, you're a priest.
I asked that question because when Father Rodrigo came back,
yeah,
he served with us.
Right.
As a deacon.
Yeah. There's been several that have taken a little extra time. I'm not the only one. Transitional deacon, there's no time on it. Yes, Molly. I think create a culture of vocations. I think in your home, I think is praying together. That's so important. It's so hard to do. Couples that I talk to rarely pray together. And yet creating that space in your home for prayer where God can be. Yes, go to church, absolutely, wonderful. But what you do in the domestic church is just as important. And I think it has a bigger effect on the youth. That's what I'm seeing in the parish. I'm seeing families who truly, yes, they come to Mass, but the families that really do make an effort, that's where vocations can take. If anything, and even if, we need holy men and we need holy lay people. Holiness is just not for the ordained or the consecrated. So developing and making children mindful of God's presence in their life and what they're doing in their home life is huge. So that... We're struggling right now. I think we're struggling. The trend, I think the culture is really difficult. I think they're very affected by that. To me, again, I'm not been in vocation work for a long time, but I feel like there's a lot of pressure to be perfect. There's a lot of pressure to have, to be, I don't know, I don't know. There's a lot of pressures out there, and it kind of is a little bit of I see men that go through the seminary, and again, I can't criticize anyone for taking time out, because I surely did. But I don't know what they're doing while they're out, and how they say today we've discerned out, and again, I don't know what that means, except that they prayerfully thought about becoming a priest, and they prayerfully decided that's not what God's calling them to, which is totally fine. But what are they doing, to live that out? That's what I'm not seeing, and I don't keep in touch with all of them, but I think pray for them, because I think a lot of these men are struggling, and the culture is not very supportive of this. But I tell you what, it is the best time to be a priest. I'm telling you, in a secular society like we're living in right now, you guys, we're standing out. We stand out, and there are so many people searching. And something that happened in 2009 that has been for me, and you all joke about it, Richard did when I got here, Father Novak likes traditional things. I like Catholic things, okay? I like when we celebrate our faith authentically and with integrity and according to the rites and the mind of the church. Why? Because it works. People are looking for that. They're looking for tradition. They're looking for things that mean something, symbols that have meaning behind them. these are the things that's great being a priest, because we have this whole, we have bells at St. John's. They just started ringing. They just started ringing. I'm not supposed to self-promote, but you know, the bells hadn't worked for 20 years. And it was just as easy as going to buy a new digital system and turn it on. And you should have seen the people this weekend. You know, just so excited. They ring from 8 to 8, so, you know, we're not hurting the neighbors. But anyway, but it's little things like that that I think can, and that's what's great about being a priest, is we get to lead people to that. One other little story in the parish, I had this couple, they've been married for maybe 30 years, and they came to have their marriage convalidated. And, you know, long story, whatever, I don't care, here they are. You know, they have children, and so we had this little ceremony planned. It was going to be in our chapel, and they called and they said they wanted to have some music. And I said, okay. And she said, we want Amazing Grace. And I said, at a wedding? Really? And then she said, how great thou art. And I said, a Protestant hymn at a Catholic wedding? Let me give you another idea. And I pulled out the hymnal, and I found this song that was written to a very familiar hymn. Beautiful words about the sacrament of marriage, beautiful words about love and family, which fits them because they're 30 years and they got grandchildren. And as I kind of sang it to them, and as I'm reading the words, he starts crying, a tear's coming down his eyes. Now this just happened last week. Now, what does that say to me? That says to me that they need a leader. If just left to your own devices, you're going to pick Amazing Grace or on Eagle's Wings. Come on, people. There are other songs. I have nothing against that song, but come on. Have we sung it enough, okay? And the thing about it is I feel like that's where I get to lead people to something more. But if I don't do that, then we're going to have Amazing Grace at a wedding, which honestly is rather depressing to me. And so anyway, one more, I think we're done, but we need to go have lunch at Antigua, which, by the way, I am very enthusiastic about that place. I love that place. It's been a while. We don't have that in Edmond. There was one question. Stephen, did you have a question? No? Okay. Thank you.
You are always a pleasure, and we always have time for you.